Good day, my name is Ryan Smith, Executive Director and Legal Counsel of Cause for Justice, a non-profit human rights and public interest organisation based in the city of Cape Town. With me today is Professor Nicola de Jager, Associate Professor in Political Science. So welcome, Nicola.
Thanks.
Yes. Our topic for discussion today is comprehensive sexuality education, and more specifically its ideological elements as well as its philosophical roots. We also want to look at its positioning in state-society relations and its role in the promotion or the stifling of diversity. Nicola, I want to turn to the first question, which I think is pertinent at this stage. What does the promotion of CSE in public schools say about state-society relations, and more importantly, what does it mean for our current political regime?
So Ryan, I want to take quite a step back and a broad perspective, and people might find it, wow, why are we going this direction? And I think it's important because sometimes, with these plans and with these scripted plans and what parents, when their kids come back and they hear what they are being taught, there's something that kind of jars and people don't quite know what it is. So I think what I want to do is I would like to actually go all the way back into political regimes and distinguish between different types of political regimes so that people have the tools to understand what is it that we're seeing, and is this consistent, for example, with a liberal democracy? And if it's not consistent with a liberal democracy, then what is really happening here and where are we going? So one of the key ways in which we distinguish between political regimes is in terms of state-society relations. So how does the state interact with society? How does society interact with the state? So if we look at a liberal democracy, which is what we have here in South Africa, the key aspect of a democracy is that we are citizens. So we are citizens where we have rights, we have responsibilities, and those rights and responsibilities are protected by our Constitution. And inside the Constitution, it allows for this diversity that you've been speaking about. It allows for pluralism, and it protects that. So inside this, it's the state, when you vote for representatives, the idea or the expectation is that they represent the broader public interest. So they are supposed to be impartial. They're supposed to be non-partisan. They're not supposed to be moved by special interests or specific interests. They are supposed to represent the broader society, and that creates safety for society. You know that you are broadly represented, you are broadly catered for, and then protected under the Constitution. The other part of the Constitution is that, and having a liberal democratic state, is that there is a restraint on the power of the state. And this comes through centuries of development. So if we go all the way back to the 16th, 17th century, we have what we call protective democracies. And so this obviously developed in Western Europe and those places where you had monarchies and dictatorships. And so what happened was that people started to push back against these executive powers. And so they were actually about protecting themselves against the state and the intrusion of the state. And so we have your early formation or your early precedent to liberal democracies. So a liberal democracy aims to limit the power and the extent of the state. And so what we've had is a separation between the public and the private spheres. And there's been the sense that the state can go so far and no further. And this also relates to the family. So the private will be the family, civil society, religious institutions. Inside there, the state is not expected to intrude. And this is why we have a liberal democracy, to limit the extent of the state. And then why do we have this? Well, it actually comes down to the valuing of every human being. So every human being has moral agency and dignity. And because of that, we therefore protect them, and we protect them against the intrusion of the state into what is private. And that's your beliefs, that's your attitudes, that's your norms, that's your values. With diversity and pluralism, this is part of being a liberal democracy. And this is what we have in South Africa. Having these liberties, having these freedoms have been also hard-earned, hard-won in our context, but also in the world over. So it protects these diversities. So the other thing With a liberal democracy then is, as I said, the state is expected to be a neutral umpire. It's not supposed to be partisan or particular to any specific personal, private interest or group interests. It's supposed to represent the broader public. So at the other extreme, and then let's go there, let's go to the other extreme of political regime types, is your totalitarian system. So where in a liberal democracy, the society are citizens with rights and responsibilities. In a totalitarian system, you are subjects. So that state-society relationship is completely a one-way. The state dictates into society, and the society must then conform. There are no rights, responsibilities. There's no recourse to law. There's no neutral umpire. The other thing is that when we call it totalitarianism, it's about that total control. So it's that control of the public, the social, the economic, the everything. So that divide, that separation between the public and the private, that goes. There's no public-private. There's just public. The private divides. The private disappears. So in other words, there's an intrusion into the family. There's an intrusion into civil society. There's an intrusion into people's private businesses. In fact, they all disappear. So one of the interesting things, if you look at an example of a totalitarian system, so your communist systems, when communism came into these countries like Hungary, for example, one of the first things they did is they removed all forms of independent civil society that were not linked to the state. If they were linked to the state, they were allowed to continue. But so running clubs, book clubs, soccer clubs, hockey meets, anything like that, where there could be independent thought and engagement and a diversity of thought and where people could engage with each other, these were closed down. And so this also comes down to another key feature of a totalitarian system, is the promotion of a single ideology. So behind it is the aim to transform society in accordance with a single ideology. So it tends to control the media. So there's the media is used rather as a mouthpiece of this ideology, and it's a single ideology. It's one orthodoxy which everybody must conform to, which everybody must not just acquiescence, but must actually enact and be in agreement with, irrespective of whether they are or aren't in agreement with. And this then is also an intrusion into the beliefs, the opinions, the values, the norms of society, and it's dictating to of those. So quite different to what one hopes and one has and should have within a democratic system. So such regimes, they seek to transform society through radical ideology and imposed beliefs. So pluralism is not countenanced. But rather the regime imposes a monistic belief system onto society.
So my question would be, in the light of the distinction between liberal democracies and totalitarian political regimes, what does these scripted lesson plans developed by the Department of Basic Education rolled out into public schools, what does this say about relationships between civil society and the state in South Africa? Are we talking about government overreach? Is this already an example of it? What does it say about the divide between public and private in South Africa? I mean, is there a growing expectation of conformity, or what is this? I mean, what is this saying, if anything?
If the CSE becomes more than optional learning aids and optional scripted plans, which it currently is. And that is actually because civil society pushed back and said, no, these can't be mandatory. And if it remains optional, then that's fine within a pluralistic society. But if they become mandatory and are imposed and expected for the schools to roll them out, then what we are seeing is a move towards a prescriptive state. We are seeing a move towards a state moving into, and as you illustrated, some of those topics are deeply personal, deeply private, and often have moral and belief system implications for people. So it is that intrusion of the public into the private, and often where the parents should be coming in. It's the parents' role to speak about moral issues, so that it's that moralistic belief system that begins to be moved into society and is used from the state. I do want to say that I think what is happening is, and we're not there yet. These are just tools that one can use to evaluate what is happening, what are we seeing. We're definitely not in a totalitarian system. We are in a liberal democracy, and that's why we could have pushback. That's why we can have engagement. But if we continue along this line and the CSE becomes mandatory, then we are moving in that direction. We are moving in the direction with the state becoming intrusive. And I would say it's actually what I would call new totalitarianism. Totalitarian in the sense that it's seeking to transform society into a single ideology, but new in that it's less the state that's driving it than it's social activists that are using the state as their instrument to push this ideology into society. So it's this social activism and this move of an ideology, which I would say is a gender ideology, if not more a radical gender ideology that's been moved into society, using the state to transform society according to this single ideology. And if other options, especially in public schools, which allows for that diversity, which allows for that pluralism, if those options are not kept open, then that is that move towards that single ideology being imposed into society.
I want to move on and ask the question. Some say that CSE and government guidelines on sexual orientation and gender identity supposedly promotes diversity and things like inclusivity. But is that really the case? Looking at what we've already touched on.
Definitely the narrative is appealing, and the narrative is appealing in terms of our liberal democracy and our constitution. So our constitution embodies, endorses and protects diversity and pluralism, and this is what a liberal democracy is about. So the South African constitution, inside our constitution is the Bill of Rights, and sections 9.3 and 9.4 are unequivocal that we cannot discriminate. There shouldn't be unfair discrimination, whether it be the state or a person cannot unfairly discriminate against someone else on the basis of their religion, on the basis of their race, their ethnicity, their gender, whether they're pregnant or not, their social status, on all of those things. That's diversity. And I'm not sure that what we are seeing, and especially if I have been into some of these training sessions presented by the Western Cape Education Department, which are labeled diversity training and inclusivity, but they very much so are promoting a single gender ideology. So if I can give you one example, in one of the sessions I was in, they spoke about the Western Cape Education Department. It was the Metro East Education Division, and they spoke about homophobic parents. So we need to combat homophobic parents. Now, it would have been good to ask them, can you please define that? What do you mean by that? Because homophobia means a hatred for and a fear of. So it's a changing of the language. So where instead of allowing for disagreement, it's saying, no, it's not disagreement, it's hatred. So it's actually a shutting down of pluralism, it's a shutting down of diversity, and it's a promoting of a single ideology, a gender ideology, or rather a radical gender ideology. You will accept it. And I think this is concerning in light of diversity and pluralism, where we can have certain universal values like mutual respect. So in school environment, you're going to have different faiths. You're going to have Islam, you're going to have Catholicism, you're going to have Protestantism and diversity of faith. But you can't expect everybody to believe in Islam. You can't expect everybody to believe in Catholicism. It's not acceptance, it's respect for. Yes. And that respect must be mutual. And the same with lifestyle choices. People choose different lifestyles, and we can be respectful of those lifestyle choices. But you cannot impose those, and you cannot expect acceptance, because that's not diversity. That's not pluralism. That's imposing. That's conformity. That's a single ideology.
Yes. Having said that, I have a question about the philosophical origins and development of what we're seeing today. I mean, this current and quite radical gender ideology, or some will speak of gender theory. So, where does it come from?
So we need to also distinguish between the radical and your social feminist or your radical gender ideology from your so-called first wave feminists. So your first wave feminists, they advocated for equality between the sexes. They called for that in the workplace that there was fairness in terms of appointment. There wasn't discrimination on the basis of sex, and wasn't discrimination on the basis of whether you were male or female or whatever your race was. So irrespective of those social qualifications, it was on the basis of your merits. And so they also, in terms of vote, the suffragettes, it was about equality, it was about fair treatment. It was fair treatment for everybody, irrespective of those factors. What we're seeing now with the radical feminists, with this move, this gender ideology, is really kind of emerging with another ideology, postmodernism. So postmodernism rose in the 1960s, 1970s. It was very much an anti, so it's an anti-modernism, an anti-enlightenment, anti-reason, anti-empirical research, really kind of countering. It was quite cynical and quite a nihilistic end, just to deconstruct, especially in the politics power relations. Everything was seen as power relations that needed to be deconstructed. But we saw a shift into the 1990s where it moved away from the cynicism into activism and social activism. So we see the shift into actively trying to transform society, actively trying to change society. And this is the same with the radical feminists. They actually call, so one of the socialist feminists would be Sheila Rowbotham, and she argues for a prescriptive state. So she even argues for, she calls it a democratic prescriptive state to transform society, to change society. In accordance with what? In accordance with their ideology. So again, that single ideology, and they're called to transform society. It's illustrative to look at the development of the discipline of political science. So we think that sometimes these ideas are new, and they're not very new. So I want to take us all the way back to Aristotle and Plato, and they're key in terms of the discipline of political science and the philosophy of political science. So both we're trying to understand what is the ideal political system and what makes for the ideal political system. But their approach to knowledge, their approach to understanding, so we use the word epistemology, so their approach to knowledge was different. So with Aristotle used what we would call the empirical approach. So he looked at different political systems and state systems, and he tried to understand which one, by comparing them, what we could learn from that, which was the ideal political system. Whereas Plato, same goal, also what is the ideal political system, he approached it from a normative approach. Instead of saying what is, and looking at what is and understanding from that, he looked at what should be. So it was normative in that it also moved into your type of utopian literature, your utopian philosophy. But again, what should be according to who? What should be according to Plato? So this is what is happening now with these types of ideologies, is that they come out of an academic environment which is less the empirical than it is the normative. And it's an activist academia, it's an activist ideology which seeks to transform society into a normative belief system, or a normative, it is almost a belief system. In terms of this is what we think society should be, and we will use the state to change it into that. The concern with that is that has there been any data done? And they don't believe in the data, they don't believe in the empirical. So we don't actually know what the long-term consequences will be.
Nicola, this term gender seems to pop up quite a bit, and it almost seems to become problematic once you start reading into the field. But where does it come from, and also how is it being used, and for what purposes in this context?
Actually, its history is quite interesting, because it comes through in 1955. A psychologist, John Money, he made a distinction between the physical differences of men and women, which he called sex, and then the behavior and the roles of a person, and the way they express themselves, which he called gender. So, women tend to be a little more feminine, or tend to sometimes be a little more caring. Men may be a little more robust. And so he said that was gender, and your biological differences, that was sex. However, what the feminists of the 1960s, 1970s, your second, third wave feminists, what they did is they argued this further, and they constructed a theory around the gender. So in other words, that whole big debate, nature versus nurture. Yeah. So what Money wasn't saying, he wasn't arguing that it's only nurture. He was saying there's nature and nurture. What the gender theorists started saying, no, there's only nurture. So gender is only constructed. Okay. It doesn't come from your sex. It's only constructed. And so they started to build this theory around it. So with the radical feminist idea, there is this clear, distinct shift from your psychology, from what we would call your hard sciences, from your biology into ideology. Mm-hmm. And using of their concepts into ideology and saying, no, everything's just nurture, it's only just constructed. And and so they took up that concept into their area, and have now taken it back into the hard sciences. And so what we're actually seeing is we're seeing a shift away from biology into ideology. So that's why with these scripted plans, it's less about the biology, and the biology is fine. I mean, kids need to understand their bodies and how their bodies work. Yeah. Biology is fine, but when you are starting to move that into our ideology, an imposing of an ideology, then that divide between the public and private has been broken. So to effect this transformation or cultural changes in society, this ideological approach calls for a prescriptive state, an intrusive state. And that's why I said it's new, because it's an activism, it's a social activism which is using the state to impose this new ideology into society.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been a good discussion and challenging one as well.